Okay, real quick. I need you to picture something. It's a Saturday morning in Miami. You just woke up. You've already handed 22% of your paycheck to Uncle Sam. Your state hit you for another 6, and now you're watching the news with your coffee. And there's this 1,000-foot floating palace loaded with 6,000 passengers, pulling something like $1 million a week in profit, just sailing away, tax-free. Not low tax, not offshore account in the Caymans tax. I'm talking 1.1% on over $11 billion in profit. That's not a typo. That's Carnival Corporation's effective tax rate over a 5-year stretch, confirmed by the New York Times. And the crazy part? It's completely legal. Today, we're breaking down exactly how the biggest cruise lines in the world, companies that are headquartered right here in the United States, have engineered one of the most audacious, most perfectly constructed tax loopholes in the history of American corporate law. I'm talking Panama, Liberia, Bermuda, the Marshall Islands, and one obscure line of the IRS tax code that makes it all work. Stick around, because this one is wild.
Let's start with the biggest misconception most Americans have about cruise lines. When you think cruise, you probably think American. And honestly, why wouldn't you? The 3 largest cruise corporations on the planet, Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean Group, and Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, are all headquartered in Miami, Florida. Their offices, their executives, their marketing teams, all right here in the US of A. They sell to Americans. According to the Cruise Lines International Association, Americans make up about 45.9% of all cruise passengers in the entire world. That's almost half the global market. And in 2018 alone, over 12.5 million passengers embarked from US ports. So yeah, American companies, American customers, American ports, American Coast Guard keeping their ships safe, American customs officers weaving passengers through, American roads leading to American ports.
But here's where things get real interesting. Every single one of those ships, or almost every single one, is not registered in the United States. Carnival, registered in Panama. Royal Caribbean, Liberia. Norwegian, Bermuda. And it's not some minor detail, like where you file your LLC paperwork. The country where a ship is registered, what's called the flag state, determines which country has legal jurisdiction over that vessel, what tax laws apply to its income, and what safety and labor regulations it has to follow. And Panama, Liberia, and Bermuda, they have basically 0 corporate taxes on foreign source income. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but surely the US government closes that loophole, right? Like, surely you can't just walk into the IRS and say, yeah, we're technically Panamanian, when your CEO is literally sipping a cafecito in Brickell? And the answer, the beautiful, maddening answer, is that the US government doesn't just allow this. There's a specific section of the tax code that enables it. It's called IRC Section 883, and it is the engine that makes this whole machine run. All right, put on your nerd hat for a second, because we need to talk about the actual law. Don't worry, I'll keep it tight. Internal Revenue Code Section 883. This is a provision that was written to help international shipping operate freely across borders. The original idea wasn't unreasonable. If you've got a shipping company that operates globally, you don't want every country they touch trying to tax the same revenue. That's a recipe for economic gridlock. So Section 883 says this: a foreign corporation is exempt from U.S. federal income taxes on income it earns from the international operation of a ship or ships, as long as the country where that corporation is based gives the same tax exemption to American ships. Simple enough, right? Except here's the loophole. Cruise lines figured out that if they just incorporate in Panama or Liberia, even if every executive, every decision maker, every real operation is in Miami, they qualify as a foreign corporation under Section 883. Panama gives American ships a tax break. Great! Carnival is now Panamanian. Revenue earned from millions of American passengers? Exempt.
And let me put some actual numbers on this so you understand the scale. In 2019, Carnival Corporation reported revenues of $20.83 billion.
That's $20 billion with a B. They paid $71 million in income taxes. If they'd paid the standard U.S. corporate tax rate of 21%, they'd have owed somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 million on just their reported income that year. That's a $529 million gap in a single year. Royal Caribbean, in 2019, $10.95 billion in revenue. They paid $36.2 million in taxes. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings actually recorded a tax benefit, meaning they effectively got money back on $6.46 billion in revenue. And zooming out even further, over a 5-year window, Carnival Corporation paid a combined corporate tax rate, federal, state, local, and foreign taxes all included, of just 1.1% on over $11.3 billion in cumulative profits. 1.1%. To put that in context, the average American worker pays an effective federal income tax rate of somewhere between 13 and 22%, depending on their bracket, before state taxes. A waitress at a diner in Tampa is paying a higher effective tax rate than one of the largest corporations in the world, a corporation that literally runs its business out of Tampa's backyard. That is not an accident. That is a masterpiece of tax engineering, decades in the making.
Now, to be fair, because I try to be, the flags of convenience system didn't start as a tax dodge. It actually started as a booze dodge. We're going back to the 1920s. Prohibition is in full swing. Congress has made it illegal to sell alcohol on ships registered in the United States. And cruise lines, which at the time were basically floating parties, had a real business problem on their hands. The solution? Re-register your ships in Panama. Panama doesn't care about America's prohibition laws. Your ship is technically Panamanian now. Pop the champagne. 2 cruise liners, the MV Reliance and the MV Resolute, were among the first ships reflagged in Panama specifically to get around U.S. law. And the business model stuck. By the 1950s, the trend exploded. What was once considered a slightly sketchy workaround became standard operating procedure. The United States, which had once boasted one of the largest privately owned merchant marine fleets in the world, watched its registered fleet practically disappear from international ocean trades.
And by the time the modern cruise industry was born, really born, in the 1970s and 80s, it was built from the ground up with offshore registration as a core feature, not an afterthought. Take Carnival Corporation itself. It was founded by Ted Arison, who built a Miami-based cruise empire while registering everything in Panama. In 1990, he renounced his U.S. citizenship and moved back to Israel, reportedly in part to avoid estate and inheritance taxes. His son Mickey took over and continued running the Miami operation. The company stayed in Miami. The ships stayed flagged overseas. That is the original playbook, and it has never fundamentally changed. A 1970 British government study called the Rochdale Report tried to formally define what a flag of convenience even means, laying out 6 criteria, including easy access to registration, little to no taxes, permission to hire non-nationals, and crucially, that the registering country has neither the power nor the administrative machinery to effectively enforce international regulations. That last point is the thing nobody talks about. We'll come back to it.
Let's talk about the countries themselves, because this is where it gets genuinely wild. Panama, the Bahamas, Bermuda, Malta, the Marshall Islands, Liberia, these are the big flag states for the cruise and shipping industries. And what do they all have in common? They're small nations whose economies are heavily dependent on 2 things: tourism and the fees they collect from having ships registered under their flags. Panama, for example, has a registration system so user-friendly you can literally do it online. Non-nationals can register a ship there quickly, easily, and cheaply. The country makes money off the registration fees and annual tonnage charges. Cruise lines get a legal address that keeps them out of the U.S. tax system. Everybody's happy, at least on paper. Now, here's the thing about flag states that doesn't get enough attention. Under international maritime law, specifically UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, once a cruise ship is more than 24 miles from any coastline, it's in international waters. And in international waters, the flag state has exclusive jurisdiction over that vessel.
Which means if something goes wrong,
a pollution discharge, a safety violation, a labor dispute, the country responsible for enforcing international maritime law is Liberia, or Panama, or Bermuda. And here's what the data says about how well that works. Critics of the system have found that foreign flag states act upon less than 2% of pollution dumping cases referred to them by the U.S. Department of State. Less than 2%. Why? Because Panama and Liberia and Bermuda need these cruise lines. Their economies depend on the registration fees and the tourism revenue. If they start getting strict, if they start actually fining cruise lines and revoking registrations, the cruise lines just move their flags somewhere more accommodating. The developing nations are essentially trapped in a race to the bottom on enforcement. It's a quid pro quo system. Cruise lines get low taxes and lax oversight. Developing nations get registration fees and economic dependence on outside investors. And the workers, often hired from developing countries at wages far below what American or European maritime labor laws would require, get squeezed in the middle.
Now, I want to be clear. I'm not just talking about taxes. The flags of convenience system has real, documented, physical consequences for the environment and for human safety. Let's start with the environment. International organizations like Friends of the Earth have estimated that cruise ships are responsible for a staggering proportion of maritime pollution. And the track record backs that up. Carnival Corporation's subsidiaries have racked up the largest criminal environmental fines ever levied in the United States for deliberate pollution. The Caribbean Princess, a Princess Cruises ship, was caught making illegal discharges of oil-contaminated bilge waste into U.S. waters, and crew members lied about it on orders from supervisors. The company eventually paid a $20 million penalty for violating its pollution probation. And Carnival's own CEO admitted there were gaps in how they followed environmental rules. And in 2020, Friends of the Earth graded 18 major cruise lines on environmental transparency. 13 of them, 13 out of 18, got an F. An F in transparency.
Then there's the Costa Concordia, January 2012. An Italian cruise ship owned by Costa Cruises, a Carnival subsidiary, strikes a rock in the Tyrrhenian Sea and capsizes. 32 people are killed. The investigation revealed that standard safety procedures were ignored, that the captain made reckless decisions, and that muster drills weren't even completed before the ship sailed. After that disaster, the industry finally changed the muster drill requirement before sailing, not after. That's a change that should have existed already. That it didn't until 32 people died tells you something about what happens when the enforcement mechanism is a small developing nation that financially depends on your goodwill.
Now, American lawmakers aren't totally asleep at the wheel here. In April 2020, right in the middle of COVID, when cruise lines were desperately asking for federal bailout money, Congresswomen Doris Matsui and Jackie Speier introduced the Cruise Integrity Act. CRUISE stands for Cruise Reform and Uniform Industry Standards Evoke Integrity. Yes, that's a real acronym. Yes, Washington absolutely wrote the bill around the acronym. The bill was sharp. It said, you want federal money? You want federal assistance? Then you need to actually incorporate and register your ships in the United States. At minimum, 50% of your fleet needs to fly the American flag. Pay your taxes like everyone else. Follow American labor laws. Adhere to American environmental standards. Congresswoman Speier put it bluntly. She said the cruise lines had been running roughshod over U.S. laws and values while incorporating abroad to dodge American taxes. The bill went nowhere. Because here's the other side of this equation. The cruise industry is extraordinarily effective at lobbying. In just the first 9 months of 2020, a year when their ships weren't even sailing, a year when they were asking for a government bailout, the cruise industry spent $3.2 million on lobbying Congress. $3.2 million to make sure the people who might regulate them didn't. It worked.
So what do we actually do about this? Look, abolishing flags of convenience entirely, just saying everyone has to register in their home country, sounds satisfying, but it's genuinely not the right answer. And I know that might be surprising coming after everything I just told you, but hear me out. These open registry countries, Panama, Liberia, the Bahamas,
Their economies depend on this system. You pull the rug out, you don't just hurt cruise lines, you crater the economies of developing nations that are already vulnerable. That's not justice, that's just spreading the pain. And honestly, forcing every cruise line to register in the US would make them subject to the most stringent maritime requirements of any nation on Earth. Requirements so burdensome that it would likely spike cruise prices dramatically and potentially push smaller lines out of business. The more realistic path is what legal scholars and maritime policy experts have been building toward: international uniformity. Work through the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which has 174 member states, to establish a uniform tax policy for cruise line revenue based on where a company's passengers actually come from.
Here's the logic. If 45.9% of all cruise passengers are Americans, then American consumers are generating nearly half of the cruise industry's value. The US, and other developed nations where passengers originate, should be able to tax a proportional share of that revenue, regardless of where the ship is flagged. Call it patron-created value. The money flows from American pockets. Some portion of the tax should flow back to American public goods. Like, I don't know, the Coast Guard that keeps those ships safe. Revenue collected through this framework could then fund the inspection infrastructure that developing nation flag states currently can't afford. You want Panama to enforce international maritime law? Give Panama the resources to actually do it. Is this a perfect solution? No. Is it politically easy? Absolutely not. Cruise lobbyists would fight it tooth and nail. But the framework exists. The IMO exists. The precedent for international cooperation on maritime regulation exists. The industry proved that after the Costa Concordia, when CLIA and the IMO worked together to mandate pre-sailing muster drills industry-wide. Change is possible. It just requires political will.
So here's where we land. The next time you're standing at a US port, watching one of those 1,000-foot floating cities sail off into the Caribbean, you're watching a company that probably collected your ticket money, employed workers under sub-American wage standards, sails under the flag of a country it has almost no real connection to, and paid somewhere between 1% and 2% in corporate taxes on billions of dollars in profit. It's legal. It's documented. It's been the playbook since Prohibition-era bootleggers figured out you could re-register a ship in Panama to sell booze on the high seas. And it keeps working because the people who could change it keep taking the money to leave it alone. Does that make you mad? Good. It should. Use that. If you're a finance nerd who wants to go deeper on this, I'm dropping links in the description to the Southwestern Law School paper, the original New York Times investigation, and SEC filings, where Royal Caribbean literally warns investors that if the US ever revokes Section 883, their whole tax structure collapses. That's right, they put it in their own SEC filings. They admit the whole thing rests on one line of the tax code. If this video hit different, share it, because most people don't know this. And the industry is counting on that. I'll catch you in the next one.